recording on both cameras here. So
Good morning. Back in March, as lockdown began, hastily written notes were placed in the windows of shops and businesses on high streets across the country. They announced an unavoidable shutdown, with no certainty about how or when they could reopen. This is every business's nightmare, but for 3 long months it has been their waking reality. Now, for some parts of our economy, the notes are beginning to come down and the shutters are beginning to come up. But for others, the crisis is still not over. We're still in the middle of the greatest crisis in a generation, one where our government sadly has been too slow to act, too slow to lock down, too slow to ramp up testing, and too slow to get PPE to our brilliant frontline workers. As lockdown restrictions begin to ease, attention is turning to the economic impact of coronavirus. Labour are very clear that government cannot afford to be too slow again. Britain needs a back-to-work budget with a focus on jobs, jobs and jobs again. What we're hearing from the government on the economy is worrying. Worrying that yet again they plan to take a hands-off approach to helping business and people's livelihoods. Worrying that the Chancellor is reported to have said he shouldn't be picking winners, as if supporting a local pub or family-run restaurant that's been boarded up at the direction of government is somehow cheating the natural order of things. Worrying that some press reports suggested the Chancellor was considering putting off his summer economic update in order to wait and see what happens this weekend when more of the lockdown lifts, even though many other countries announced weeks ago their recovery packages focused on backing the green jobs of the future. Waiting to see is not a strategy. The OECD's Global Outlook report, published last month, made for sobering reading. It suggested that the economic hit on the UK due to the coronavirus would be the worst of all industrialised nations, and the unemployment levels in the UK could be the second worst in the industrialised world. Just as the hit to our population's health from coronavirus threatens to be one of the worst of all industrialised countries, so our economy stands at a crossroads. This is not a time to wait and see. In Leicester this week, we've seen the first major reimposition of lockdown. The government promised these lockdowns would be local, but the reality is they're being driven from Whitehall. We still do not have a functioning track, trace and isolate system, and local authorities are not getting the data they need in the time they need it. The experience in recent days and weeks in Leicester is a familiar one in our response to this crisis. Muddled, confusing, with a refusal to bring in local authorities, and too slow, much, much too slow. We desperately need and want government to get this right. Lives and livelihoods depend upon it, because for as long as there is confusion and delay in the public health response, many people will stay away from our high streets and out of our shops, pubs and restaurants. At this time of continued national crisis, Labour is determined to act as a constructive opposition. So in that spirit, I call on the Chancellor to acknowledge the impact of the slow health response on our economy and do something about it. Today, we call on government to lay out plans to extend support schemes for businesses and people in areas like Leicester that are forced into local lockdowns. These support schemes should serve as economic sandbags, ensuring localised second waves of COVID-19 don't wash away businesses and jobs in their wake. Labour have also repeatedly set out constructive solutions when it comes to test, track and isolate, including changes to sick pay, so people are not having to choose between self-isolating and providing for their families. And we have repeatedly called for clear public health messaging with unambiguous and strongly enforced guidance. These solutions are critical to reducing infection and to building trust and aiding our economic recovery. We've also set out the fiscal measures government should take to first secure and then turbocharge our recovery. Instead of the limited summer economic update promised next week, we need a real back-to-work budget. It must focus on preventing unemployment, supporting the unemployed back into work, and creating the jobs of the future so that when we emerge from this crisis, Britain is ready to come back even better than before. We already know many of the policies which can prevent and combat unemployment and the long-term costs unemployment incurs. And we know that many other countries announced their economic recovery packages not just days, but weeks ago. Already, we are falling behind others. This is no time to wait and see. It's the time to act in our country's interest. Labour supported the job protection scheme and self-employed schemes. Indeed, we called for them. We also called for an exit strategy. But as with the lifting of lockdown, what we have now is an exit without a strategy. First, government must abandon its one-size-fits-all wind-down of the job protection and self-employed schemes. We need a targeted strategy that acknowledges that workers in struggling sectors cannot and should not be treated in the same way as workers in sectors that are already back to full capacity. This is not about picking winners, in the Chancellor's words. It is about protecting those who have lost through no fault of their own. It is about giving people across the country a fair chance. The reward for months of sacrifice cannot be a redundancy notice. This week, we saw a wave of companies announcing enormous job losses because the government is refusing to shift from its one-size-fits-all approach. Smaller companies have a shorter redundancy period to avoid the same flood of redundancy notices for workers in smaller companies later on. Government must act now and abandon its one-size-fits-all approach. When we talk about our economy, it can feel distant and remote. Interest rates and budgets and spreadsheets, it's anything but. The economy is our jobs and family incomes. It's our high streets and our communities. It's the things that add meaning and character to the places we live and love. It's small business owners who've put their life and soul into building their businesses. It has been heartbreaking to hear from many of them in recent weeks how they feel their businesses slipping through their fingers because of a temporary lack of cash flow, even though with the right targeted support now, they would be perfectly viable in the long term. That frustration, that anger, of working hard all your life, playing by the rules, doing the right thing, waiting your place patiently in the queue, only to find it snatched away from you by a combination of this terrible crisis and government's refusal to help. Supporting them now isn't about picking winners. It's about basic fairness. Government must also act now to provide support for those who've become unemployed. Instead, the DWP are reintroducing sanctions at a time when there are more than 8 people unemployed for every vacancy. This government seems completely divorced from the scale of the unemployment crisis facing us. It must speedily put in place the active labour market policy that already operates in many other countries and which our job centres do not have the capacity to provide. Government must also act now to support the jobs of the future. And here we need guarantees of delivery, not just warm words. In 2015, the Conservative government promised to huge fanfare 200,000 new homes for first-time buyers. Not a single one of those homes was built. The Conservatives have talked and talked, they have not built. If you could construct houses out of Conservative press releases, promises and hot air, the housing crisis in this country would have ended years ago. Instead, the rate of home ownership has fallen and almost 800,000 fewer households under 45 own their own home now compared to in 2010. The Conservatives have talked and talked, they have not built. And on the green infrastructure that every region and nation of this country is crying out for, there have been promises and paper commitments, but precious little action. The Conservatives have talked and talked, they have not built. 2 years ago, the National Infrastructure Commission published an assessment. There has been no official response. And this week, the Prime Minister tried to claim he was creating a new deal. Most of it was re-announcements of things we've heard before, so it wasn't really new. And when we cut through the bluster and looked at the detail of what the Prime Minister was actually offering, it works out at less than £100 of investment per person. So it's not much of a deal either. 10 years of Conservative government, 10 years of talk, 10 years of inaction. Instead of yet more promises and yet more talk, we need a laser focus on jobs, jobs, jobs. To deliver on jobs, the Chancellor's statement must meet 4 key tests. First, it must focus not on re-announced, rehashed prestige projects, but on supporting high-quality jobs. The test of a project can't be if it piques the interest of the Prime Minister's closest advisor. Instead, projects must involve local firms. They must give the local workforce new skills and training. They must lead to material improvement in the quality and availability of local employment. And programmes to support employment must be measured against the success of schemes like the Future Jobs Fund and reflect the different challenges faced by young workers, older workers, and particularly impacted areas of the UK. Second, the Chancellor's statement must buck the trend of the last 10 years and rebuild economic resilience right across our country. As a recent report noted, there's little chance of a so-called bounce back in areas such as Pendle, Burnley or Barnsley, where local authority service spending has fallen by 53%, 51% and 35% over the decade in real terms. And public support for ailing companies must come with good value strings attached to support local employment, to keep value in the UK by avoiding dividend payments, share buybacks and the use of tax havens, and to adhere to strong environmental requirements. Third, every single project must be consistent with the drive to net zero so we can build the green jobs of the future. Last week's Committee on Climate Change report showed how far the UK is falling behind. Now is the time for action. Just as the German, Danish and South Korean stimulus packages have focused on green technologies, so must the UK's if we're to avoid falling behind other countries. And fourth, any benefits of investment now must not be cancelled out by poor decisions later. Because while the Prime Minister says now that those who've borne the brunt of this crisis will not be called on to pay for it, we've seen the opposite over the last 10 years. Since this dreadful virus struck, we've seen who our key workers really are. Those who staff our NHS, those working in our emergency services, those keeping our supermarkets open and the elderly and vulnerable cared for. Our key workers are the people keeping bins collected, children educated and the country safe. Those on the front line of this crisis have heroically risen to the challenge over the last few months. But for many, that follows a decade of reductions in pay, security and living standards. Over the last 10 years, the gap in income and wealth has increased and living standards for low and middle income people have stagnated, at the same time as taxes for the very best off have been reduced. So finally, government must commit at the very least to not increase taxes or cut support for low and middle income people during the period while we recover from this crisis. Because just like the small business that fears for its future, what people want, what they deserve is fairness. We cannot go back to business as normal. We cannot wait and see. We cannot have more empty promises. We cannot have more inaction. We need a response which recognises the scale of the challenge we face. And the first step in this, the first move to get Britain back on its feet, needs to happen now. Britain needs a back-to-work budget, one that focuses on jobs, jobs, jobs. Thank you very much indeed. I'm very pleased that we now have a number of members of the press joining us and also a number of members of the public. I believe the first member of the press who's joining us is Alex Forsyth from the BBC. Hello there, Alex. Looking forward to your question.
Hello, Chancellor. Thanks very much. You talk about Leicester being the first major lockdown, and the Labour leaders talk about the fact we might face months and months of local lockdowns. So does this suggest that Labour support easing of restrictions that's due to come in tomorrow, or do you think it's too soon? And when you talk about extending support for business, would Labour extend the furlough scheme indefinitely? And if not, what sectors would you extend it for, and for how long?
Thanks very much indeed, Alex. And I think the first thing that I would say is very much to offer my sympathies to those in Leicester. Clearly this is a very difficult time, and obviously many businesses have been preparing to reopen this weekend. They were desperate to reopen and they're not able to do so because of the reimposition of that lockdown. The first thing that I would say around this is that we really need to have a much speedier response and communication with local areas so that there can be much more finely targeted lockdowns. Having that kind of a lockdown across such a major area clearly will have enormous impacts for those businesses. So that must be surely the number one priority. When it comes to support for those different businesses, we said to government it needs to have a strategy for these kinds of situations, a strategy of economic support, just as it needs to have a strategy for different sectors of the economy. And Alex, we haven't said that we think the furlough system should continue in its current form indefinitely. Clearly, that cannot be the case. But we do need to have targeted support for those sectors that are suffering the most. And we know which ones they are. They're hospitality, tourism, parts of manufacturing that have been particularly strongly affected by this crisis. And frankly, unless we have that targeted support, we will see a very negative economic impact for the future. We know how expensive mass unemployment is, both for individuals and for our economy as a whole. So the question is whether we can afford not to have that targeted approach. In terms of the lockdown that's occurring, the opening of the lockdown that's occurring across the rest of the economy this weekend, we've consistently said we want to see businesses reopening, but that process has been made far riskier by the fact that we don't have test, track and isolate fully rolled out and working at full steam across the country. So again, we call on government, please listen to the constructive solutions that we've set out to try and get that system working effectively, because ultimately we need to have the public health measures in place to prevent additional lockdowns and make sure people have confidence to actually be going back into those pubs, shops and restaurants this weekend. Great, thank you very much indeed, Alex. So I believe we next have Sam Coates from Sky with us.
Government, in part because Labour was making limitless spending plans, didn't appear to acknowledge that there were any limits on the amount of money that can be borrowed by the government. Has anything changed with you in the Shadow Chancellor's chair as you promise more spending than government here today? Do you think that there are any limits that need to be imposed? Do you think that we could ever be in a situation where your spending plans are so big that the markets frankly refuse to fund the British government, as Andrew Bailey suggested that they might have done earlier this year?
Great, thank you very much, Sam. And I should say that I missed the very first couple of sentences of your question, but I think I did get the gist of it. And thank you for being with us. What we're calling for is targeted spending. And actually, when I've talked to economists who might normally be viewed as having a whole range of different views around the political system and political parties, all of them are saying that we need to have an approach which reflects the fact that this is a different kind of crisis to what we've experienced before. It's one where the impact on different sectors has been particularly severe. Very obviously, we haven't had government closing down different parts of the economy before as part of a crisis like this, an economic crisis. And we need to have a tailored response. So what Labour is calling for is not generalised increased spending. We're saying it needs to be targeted where the real need is. It needs to be targeted at those sectors which are really struggling. It needs to reflect the fact that actually mass unemployment isn't just very costly for individuals who experience it directly. It's very costly for our economy as a whole. We know that 20 years down the line, someone who has been unemployed in their youth is likely to be earning up to a fifth less, obviously paying less tax as a result, potentially contributing less to our economy as well. So we need to be aware of that long-term perspective. We're concerned that the UK government hasn't been aware of that long-term perspective, and it has been taking a different approach to many aspects of this crisis than many other countries. And just finally, I would say that when we look back on this crisis, I think we will see areas where spending has been wasted. We've had the whole debacle over the app, for example. We've had everything that's occurred around different testing systems, where we've said consistently to governments, please listen to the solutions that are being put forward by local actors, by those experts already in the field. Now, we need to see government listening around that in the future. That's very, very important when it comes to value for money, as well as the effectiveness of our healthcare response. So I hope that answers your question, at least the parts that I could hear of the question that you posed, Sam, and thanks for being with us. Now, I believe that we have a journalist from the ITN with us.
Yeah. Hi, Anneliese. It's Paul Brand here from ITV News. One way to protect jobs is for people to get out tomorrow and start spending when lockdown is lifted. So will you be going down the pub, and does Labour encourage other people to do the same? And secondly, on furlough, it is the most expensive economic intervention in history. I think it's fair to ask Labour, how long would you extend it for? You want it to be extended. So would you have it for the whole of 2021? When would you say enough is enough and furlough has to end?
Great, thanks very much, Paul. So first of all, on the question of will I be going to the pub at the weekend? Well, I have two small children. I have to say that maintaining social distancing at the best of times is a bit of a challenge. I hope, however, people will be going out to make use of those new opportunities, to support local businesses. But of course, we all need to make sure, and I very much include myself in that we are following those guidelines at all time. I think it's really important that everyone feels safe as they go into businesses, and there may be groups of people who might feel less at risk, particularly young people, for example. We need to make sure that everyone feels safe going into different businesses. I think that's really critically important. Certainly I've been trying to do my bit to support my local businesses of all types, and I'm going to continue doing that. And Paul, just to repeat that message around the furlough scheme, Labour's not saying that we think the furlough scheme as it exists at the moment should be continued in perpetuity. The same applies with the self-employed support scheme. But we do believe that government should have a strategy for those schemes that is more targeted and that ensures that support is available for those sectors that have no prospect of reopening and getting back to full capacity now. And the problem with not having any plan for those sectors, and we keep being promised sector deals in different areas and those deals never materialising, the problem with that is that we are going to have those additional waves of unemployment coming into the jobs market. We're already seeing a whole wave of redundancies just being announced. It's likely that will be mirrored by small businesses, which won't be hitting the headlines. That will happen every time we see the same one-size-fits-all approach being taken to the withdrawal of support for different industries. And the problem with that is that we can't reintegrate people back into those jobs without the support that's needed. So Labour's policy is not just about what we do with those support packages, it's about government stepping up to the plate and delivering support that's needed for those people who are becoming unemployed. We're too far behind on that. There's many things that we need to do. I set out some of them in my speech, and I really hope that the Chancellor is listening. Thank you very much indeed, Paul. Right, so we now have, I believe at this stage, Helen Kennett, who's joining us very kindly from Rolls-Royce. Hi, Helen, sorry.
Good morning, hi. You will have seen the unprecedented times for the aerospace and aviation sectors, and there's real concern in our communities and across the trade unions. But as a sector, we have so much to contribute: cutting-edge engineering and R&D, good, well-paid, highly skilled jobs around the country, and also a very clear vision for a green recovery. We welcomed the words of support from Ed Miliband for the aerospace sector, and across the country, we're working closely with our union partners on our vision for the future. Building on that engagement, what is your ambition and plan for the aerospace industry and its significant contribution to the UK economy?
Well, thanks very much indeed, Helen, and I really share your vision of the promise of, indeed, the aerospace industry for the future. And I've been very much encouraged by that focus on ensuring that the environmental contribution is radically improved. And I think in this case, we really need the UK government to be looking at what other countries are doing in this space. And as you'd anticipate, I've been discussing this very frequently with Ed Miliband, the Shadow BEIS Secretary, and with industry as well. In many other countries, we see a proper strategy for aerospace and indeed for aviation as well. And we recognise that there will be change in those sectors. There will have to be change because of the drive to net zero, but we need to have a strategy for that change. And we've seen, I would say in France in particular, very clear backing from government for that strategy to make sure that cutting edge technologies are developed in that country. Britain shouldn't be falling behind. So that's my main message to the Chancellor now. We need to make sure that we're not left behind in that race for those high technology jobs in aerospace and in other industries as well. Thank you very much. So if I can now ask, please, Philip Richardson to ask his question. Thanks for joining us, Philip.
Thank you. Hello, I'm currently on furlough and from a small town in County Durham, one of those towns that has been forgotten about so many times in different recessions and different downturns in the economy. How will places like where we are be protected from the worst of this crisis, particularly small towns up and down the country?
Well, thank you very much indeed, Philip, for joining us. And I have to say that your question really reflects what people were saying to me when I did a remote visit to County Durham a few weeks ago. And, people were saying exactly the same thing as what you've mentioned, that they really feel like they've been left behind. And of course, we do see that pattern of really an enormous gap actually in investment across our country. We see that 7 out of the 9 English regions have actually seen their per capita investment going down over recent years. So there's a big problem there. Labour's saying that we shouldn't be having a top-down approach. We instead should be involving particularly local authorities who really understand their local patch, but also local business organisations, trade union branches that are based locally as well, pulling those different actors together. And we should have government listening to them about what will work for their areas when it comes to preventing additional unemployment and generating those new opportunities for the future. I've been talking to lots of different local authority leaders over the last few weeks. They've said they haven't necessarily had that sustained discussion with government, but we need to have it because there's no point in potentially some additional job opportunities arising from investment if they're not going to lead to sustained good quality employment in areas like your own, in places like Consett. We really need to have that focus going forward. So thanks so much for your question, Philip. I really appreciate you being on the call with us today. If I can move on now, please, to Laura Hughes from the Financial Times. Hi, Laura. Hear you. Maybe you need to press a button. I'm sorry, Laura, that's still not coming through. I'm sorry, it's still not coming through. I do apologise, Laura. Do you want to give it one last go and then we can maybe move on to the next person and then try and come back? Okay, I think unfortunately we don't seem to be able to get through to you, Laura. I'm really sorry about that. Hopefully we can somehow bring you in later on, hopefully. If I could move on, please, instead to Richard Partington from The Guardian. Hi, Richard.
Morning, Shadow Chancellor. Thank you for taking my question. I hope you can hear me. So you've said that the furlough scheme should not run indefinitely, but would you be committed to extending it till the end of next year at the least? It's a Resolution Foundation recommendation. And how should that extra spending be funded? It's estimated to cost about £60 billion as it stands. Would Labour propose a wealth tax potentially to finance this extra spending, or would you continue with higher levels of borrowing at record levels?
Great, thanks very much indeed, Richard. Well, first of all, around the continued extension of the furlough scheme, the job protection scheme, as I said before, we're not saying that scheme should continue indefinitely across all sectors. It does need to become more targeted. The same applies to the self-employed support scheme. But unless we have support for those particularly impacted sectors, the inevitable result will be more of what we've already seen this week. It will be more major announcements of job redundancies. We'll see more people being pushed into a jobs market that just simply cannot absorb people at the moment. We've got 8 applicants chasing every one position at the moment. Now that in the long run, and indeed in the short and medium run when it comes to social security, is going to be very expensive. That's why I've called on the Chancellor to model the impact actually of his withdrawal of the furlough scheme and the self-employed scheme on unemployment. That doesn't seem to have happened, at least it's not been released publicly. And I'm confident that actually we would find a targeted continuation of support as something which was good value in the long run, not just something that supported individuals, but something that supported our economy as well. And when it comes to how this is paid for, as I said, I actually think it would be good value because it would be preventing those costs of long-term mass unemployment. But you know, governments do have a choice around this. Now, currently, we're in a very low interest rate environment. You know, just about every country is in a similar position there. Every industrialised country, they are able to be making these kinds of spending commitments right now without currently negative impacts. But that could change into the future. I acknowledge that. And when that does change, I've been very clear. It should be those who have the broadest shoulders who are asked to make more of a contribution. You know, we've seen over the last 10 years, low and middle income people really seeing their living standards squeezed. That actually dampened down our recovery after 2010. We cannot have that happening again now. So thank you very much indeed, Richard, for joining us. If we move on now, please, to Patrick Mcguire from The Times. Hi, Patrick.
Morning. I just want to pick up on what Richard said about wealth taxes specifically, but also taxes in general. Obviously, the Prime Minister hasn't ruled out tax rises. He's been very careful not to rule out tax rises. Obviously, being constructive is the watchword of your opposition. If the government brings forward tax rises, say a penny in the pound on income tax or a rise on corporation tax, will you? Are there any tax rises you won't support, or do you accept that you will, support whatever tax rises the government bring forward? And just on a wealth tax again, obviously that's something, as Richard probably said, I didn't actually get the audio on his question that John McDonnell proposed, and you've chosen this shadow team. Are you happy to continue that policy?
Patrick, so first of all, I think it's really, really important that we recognise that our taxation system has actually become in many ways less progressive over the years. We saw, of course, the taxes paid by the very, very best off people being reduced over the last 10 years, and a big, big squeeze on everyone else's living standards. Now, if government decided that instead of requiring those with the broadest shoulders to be making more of a contribution, that instead there would be generalised tax rises across the whole of the population. No, I don't think that should be supported. I think that would damage demand at a time when we really need to be trying to encourage that demand. And it would also simply not be fair, because we have seen that reduction in the contribution made by the very best off over the years. And I really don't think that government should be seeking, rather than evening that up, instead to be targeting everybody at the same time. When it comes to wealth taxation, I mean, again, we have seen many changes in this area over the years, and we've seen actually an increase in inequalities in wealth over the years. I think the government does need to look at this area. I don't think we're in a fair situation where the amount of tax paid by the very worst off people is actually less proportionately as part of their income than that for the very best off. And of course, for the very, very best off people, quite a bit of their money coming in is derived from wealth. I think we do need to have that new settlement, and actually much of the opinion data has indicated that that's got a lot of support amongst the UK population as well. So I understand that we now have Laura back again, which is fabulous. Laura Hughes from the Financial Times. Hopefully we'll be able to hear you now, Laura.
Morning, sorry about that. You've been very clear that Labour don't support the current furlough scheme carrying on as it stands, but you've also called for targeted action and a strategy for certain industries. I'm still not quite clear exactly what Labour's strategy would be. Would you extend the furlough scheme just for those specific industries, and if so, in what way? And if not, what is your strategy?
Yep, thank you very much, Laura. Well, yes, we would extend the scheme for those sectors that are particularly impacted. I've said that consistently. We do think that that is necessary for the reasons that I've set out previously, because without any support, and of course this is in the absence of any alternative from government, we simply will see that very significant rise in unemployment that we've already started to see this week because of that introduction of a uniform employer contribution that's coming in. So we believe that action is necessary. You know, if government were to come up with an alternative, if they were to deliver those sector deals that have been promised, then we might be in a different situation, but we are not there. And simply not shifting from that one-size-fits-all approach in these circumstances is almost inevitably going to be leading to additional mass unemployment. And as I said before, that has a very, very significant cost for our economy, as well as, of course, for those individuals. So we think it's the wrong approach. So I hope that answers your question. I'm really pleased that we could get you back on again to ask it properly in person. Lovely. So if we could move on now, please, to Chris Earle.
Hi there, good morning. At Warvin, we manufacture durable, sustainable clay drainage products. Along with the wider building product sector, we are a key part of the supply chain into new build housing. In these uncertain times, what can local and national policymakers do to keep and accelerate house building in the UK?
Well, thank you very much indeed for being with us. And I think that's an absolutely critical question. Of course, as I said before, we've actually seen very major reductions in home ownership occurring over the last 10 years. That really needs to be dealt with. Now, I have to say to you, I don't think the answer to this is just changing the planning system, because actually we've got huge numbers of homes which have already got planning consent, but which have not actually been built. Instead, I think there are many other measures that government should be taking. They should be working with those local authorities, local business associations, with the local enterprise partnerships who've had to, of course, create those local industrial strategies to make sure that they can build out with them in a planned manner and meeting the needs of different communities. They need to be focusing as well on that skill shortage which exists in house building. Now, it was already there, but it's become more acute actually as a result of this crisis. So we've said that government needs to be working very closely with house builders, with trade unions, with those different providers of training and skills, so that we can actually get our people trained up. And you know, that relates to that test of government's recovery programme. If it doesn't result in the kinds of local jobs that we need, the kind of skilled construction jobs that we really need in our different communities, then from my perspective, it will have failed. So thank you very much indeed for being with us. Thank you for your really important question. So now if we could move on, please, to Tolu Frimpong. Great, hi.
Hi, Shadow Chancellor. Thank you for taking my question. I was recently made redundant after 10 years of service by my employer. I was due to return from maternity leave in March and was subsequently placed on furlough leave until the end of June. And I just wanted to ask what you think the government can do to help people like myself make a quick return into work.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Tolu. And I first of all just want to express my sympathy really to you for what's happened to you. I think your experience is in common with so many people right across our country, people who've been working really hard, doing the right thing, and then through no fault of their own have ended up in this kind of a situation. So, you know, I really want to express that sympathy to you. And I believe that you need to have support so that you can get back into work. And that support right now, unfortunately, just simply isn't there. I mean, we've seen our job centres, the staff there, completely consumed with processing claims. They're not able to be there to help people to access the kind of training that's needed, the kind of support that's needed to get people back into work in a situation where, as I said, about 8 applicants are chasing every job. You need to have that support. Now, we don't have to remake the wheel here. We've got other models from the UK previously, schemes like the Future Jobs Fund that were really successful at getting people back into work. We're saying to government it needs to be delivering that kind of a scheme for you now. And finally, just all the best of luck with your search. As I said, I know that your situation is in common with so many people, and it's a really tough time right now. So thank you for sharing your experience with us just now. So I believe that was the last question that we've had as part of this event. I want to really thank everybody who's taken part in it. Thank you to everybody who's watched this. And the last thing I want to say is I really hope that we will see that back to work budget next week, because we really need now to have that focus on jobs, jobs, jobs. Thank you.